Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session. During this session, speaker will present how the internal quality assurance reacted in the emergency situation in times of COVID-19 across Europe. We have with us Mairéad Boland. Thank you very much for participating in this forum and sharing your knowledge and experience in the Irish context with us. The title of the communication is Adaptations to Internal Quality Assurance in Irish Higher Education Institutions in Response to COVID-19. Its authors are Mairéad Boland, Laura Flynn, Roisin Morris Drennan, and Orlet Lovely. Mairéad Boland is Senior Quality Officer in Quality and Qualifications Ireland, Teixeira Education Monitoring and Review Unit, where she coordinates the institutional review process for publicly regulated higher education institutions and the validation of doctoral research degree programs leading to quality and qualification Ireland awards. Prior to that, she worked as a research associate and lecturer. Thanks again. After this short introduction, I invite Mairéad to start your presentation. As already said, audience can ask questions. Please, Mairéad.
Perfect. So you should be seeing my presentation on screen. Thank you very much, Joachim, for your introduction. So as you've noted, I'm presenting the results of an analysis that we in QQI conducted of how effectively the internal QA systems of Irish public HEIs facilitated those institutions in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. We looked at a discrete period, so that was from March until the end of August 2020. And the three sources that we used for our analysis are, first, a report that QQI conducted on modifications to teaching, learning and assessment in response to the pandemic. Second, a series of notes from QQI's periodic quality dialogue meetings. And third, a survey of public HEI communication via their websites. In conducting the analysis, we looked at three areas. So they were, first of all, policies and procedures, which aligns with standard 1 of the ESG, 1.1 of the ESG, governance, again aligning with standard 1.1, and information to stakeholders, which we felt best aligned with standard 1.8, public communication. So to look at the first area, policies and procedures, we found that on the whole, institutions' core QA policies and procedures were really considered to be sufficiently robust and flexible to accommodate the exceptional circumstances brought about by the pandemic. And as an example, so one of the areas where this existing flexibility was found was in terms of the no disadvantage policy that was adopted by Irish institutions. So it was found that there really already policies and procedures had provisions that were capable of dealing with exceptional circumstances. Where there was adaptation to existing procedures, these looked often at online methodologies for teaching, learning and assessment to allow for additional flexibility for students. We did find that something that was highly valued during the period we looked at was system level discussion and collaboration. And this really was a feature of the Irish education response to the pandemic. And indeed, we were also able to collaborate with colleagues from the Union of Students in Ireland, the Technological Higher Education Association and the Irish Universities Association in this presentation. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see where there were changes to core policies and procedures, they dealt with 4 discrete areas. It will be interesting to see whether these changes will in future be adopted once we move past the pandemic, we think that some of them likely will, and one area where we noted this was in terms of virtual review visits, where often the online nature of the visit accommodates increased international participation. Moving on to governance, we noted in the TLA report that often hierarchies of committees and working groups were involved in dealing with coordinating the management and implementing the necessary change in response to the pandemic, with academic councils sitting at the top of those hierarchies and approving changes. There were 3 broad groups that we noted that were involved in responding to the pandemic and planning to mitigate effects of the pandemic, and they were contingency planning groups, operational planning groups and subgroups, and horizon scanning groups looking at the longer term effects. Institutions noted here that broad representation was important, but also some institutions noted that they actually set up separate groups or subgroups to ensure that regard was had to the needs of particular. In terms of academic decision making, again, I suppose in line with the principle of institutional autonomy, there was no single sectoral approach. Institutions were free to determine what approach was best suited to their own particular context. But we did note that there were 2 broad approaches. The first of these was a subsidiarity-based approach, where authority was devolved by academic council to a subgroup to enable decision-making that was swift and agile. And this devolution was generally time limited. There was a sunset clause with the possibility of an extension. On the other hand, some institutions deemed that their existing governance decision-making structures were sufficiently flexible to respond to the rapidly evolving public health situation. Moving on, because I'm conscious of time, to communication. Here we noted that through our survey of websites from the beginning of March, there was really a huge amount of communication with a variety of stakeholders. For the purpose of this presentation, we really focused on staff and students, and this just provides an exact representation of really what was happening during the period we looked at. In terms of the channels used, there was a really broad variety. Social media was very prominent, but peer learning was also noted by students as a really important source of communication. I'm going to give you just there, you can have a look on the slide at the types of messages and the areas of focus for institutions. And finally, because I think I'm nearly at the end of my 5 minutes, if not already, our conclusions were that the principles of autonomy and subsidiarity really did support agility and enabled tailored decision-making by institutions. Sectoral networks and collaboration were really instrumental in response to the pandemic. Students and student representatives were really vital in terms of communicating with students, and they were invaluable throughout the period that we looked at and continue to be. And finally, the quality assurance infrastructure established by institutions proved crucial in the approaches to change management, and that inspires confidence in the reasonableness of those changes. Thank you. I think you're muted, Joaquin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. And now we have a few minutes for some questions. And the first is, what does the experience of the pandemic tell us about the robustness and agility of institutional quality assurance systems?
Well, we concluded that the institutional quality assurance systems were both sufficiently robust and agile to respond very well to the crisis. So, for example, where institutions felt that revisions to existing policies and procedures were required, their IQA systems were sufficiently agile to ensure that those changes were swiftly approved and implemented. And often then looking at existing policies and procedures, they were also in many cases sufficiently flexible to enable institutions to broaden interpretations to respond to those extraordinary circumstances they found themselves in. I mean, we really saw throughout the process that institutions were very well able to respond and were enabled in their response by their IQA systems.
Thank you for your answer. And the next is, despite all efforts, the transition from face-to-face to online was not perfect, of course. And what are the main difficulties for the quality assurance systems that you identify in this period?
The difficulties in moving to online, I suppose access was a big one for students. So in terms of access to devices, access to internet, institutions were very good at ensuring that they did maintain a clear line of communication with students in those circumstances. So we had examples of institutions really directly contacting individual students to see whether they had sufficient, whether they had devices that were capable of allowing them to continue their learning online. And in the event that they didn't, some institutions actually provided devices for those students. I suppose also just maintaining contact, but that again, as I've said, communication was something that broadly seems to have been very good across the public HEIs in Ireland, and a variety of means of communication were used to ensure that various different cohorts, and particularly vulnerable cohorts, were reached and were continued to engage with their learning online. So that's just one example, I suppose.
Thank you. And for a short answer, do you think that after COVID-19, the situation will return as before?
I don't think so, no. Certainly not from this analysis. Also anecdotally, we've been hearing from various different stakeholders, HEIs, professional bodies, and so on, that they find the adaptations they've made have really led to improvements in their work, and they do plan to maintain many of those adaptations, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for your response. The topic is very, very interesting, but I will have to finish. To conclude, the contributions that Mairéad shared with us resulted from the participation of all stakeholders, and therefore the results are consistent. So I like the great goal of KIKI, which was to stay focused during the COVID-19 pandemic on maintaining public confidence in the quality of education provided. It was very, very important. And Mairéad shared with us good practices and good ideas that can be adapted and replicated by quality agencies in other countries. I like, for example, community of practices between the National Quality Agency, higher education institutions, and unions, students, share the information to stakeholders, relevant information on different topics, using different channels for different audience. Students' unions working closely with their institutions and KIKI. In short, participation, the chat, and I inform you that we will receive a link to the recording and the presentations of this session. Thank you all.
Very, very much, yeah, great to see so many participants for this breakout room. I'm Gohar Hovhannisyan, the president of the European Students' Union, and I'm very excited to welcome for the presentation in this short session to our speaker presenter, Ahidoba De Franchi Manchev, who is the head of the quality at the Center for Continuing and Distance Education of the University of Geneva in Switzerland. She participates in development of quality culture within the programs and orchestrates the different certification and accreditation procedures, and she has experience for over 20 years now working in the field of continuing education. She will be sharing with us a presentation about quality assessment of distance teaching and learning at the University of Geneva, and we invite you to engage with this presentation on the basis of your experience and opinions using the chat function for questions, so that when the presentation is done, I'll be able to pick up your questions and discuss them with our presenter. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours, Ahidoba.
Thank you so much, Gohar, for this introduction. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for attending this session. I will talk about a project of University of Geneva on quality assessment of distance teaching and learning. I don't know how many of you have watched the video that was proposed before the session, but in case you have not done so, I hope this 5 minutes short presentation will make you want to watch it to get some more information, because this is going to be very short. The intention of this project was to get an idea of the situation of distance teaching and learning in terms of quality assurance in our university. It was for us time to see at which stage of development we were on this topic. The analysis we made was made on data that we collected before the COVID-19 crisis, but the document, the report, was published end of May of this year, exactly in the middle of the crisis. So it was very timely. That made us able to write recommendations for future developments. Very visible, in a very visible way. Here you can see the results of the report on the 6 key dimensions that we based the analysis on. You can see that there was 1 dimension on red light, 1 on green light, and 4 on yellow-orange light. So we can say it's a quite good situation. Seeds have been planted, some have grown up already, but there is still work to be done. The good thing is that now we see where we should focus our work. For this presentation, I chose to mention some recommendations of the report focused on 3 topics. The first one is pedagogical expertise related to e-learning. You could call it also instructional design. The second topic is integration of e-learning into the institutional strategy of the institution. And third, the modalities of teacher training. If we take the first one, pedagogical expertise related to e-learning, the first item I mentioned on this slide is an initiative that was developed as an answer to the crisis, and that allowed us to tick 3 recommendations of the report. 1, make more visible the existing training offer, provide a guide to the use of open educational resources, and define and value tutoring. 2 other recommendations that we still need to work on. 1 is to develop this kind of expertise at the faculty level as a complement to common services, and to introduce it in the process of validation of programs in the faculty level. The second topic is the integration of e-learning into the institutional strategy. Again, this initiative of distance and hybrid teaching portal for the teaching staff allowed us to tick the recommendation as we displayed an institutional positioning on e-learning for this, situation. Two other recommendations is to explain the positioning of the University of Geneva in terms of e-learning in the digital strategy of the institution, implementation and monitoring indicators. The last is document the advantages and disadvantages of the hybrid distant format, launch studies on that, and make the results available on, for example, the distance teaching portal. The last element is the modalities of teacher training. Again, the distance and hybrid teaching portal allowed us to answer two recommendations: make more visible the existing training offered for teaching staff and developed it further, and promote the exchange of practices and the teamwork within the institution. Three more recommendation: establish long-term recommendations for online exams, value the training courses followed by the teaching, the technical, the administrative staff in the human resources file as a encouragement, and integrate the digital skills into the human resources policy in terms of recruitment and continuing education of staff. So this is very briefly some points to make you want to see the video and maybe talk more about that.
Thank you so much for keeping the time and showing important bullet points that hopefully will engage our audience to reflect with questions. I will probably start with the first question until the others think and drop in their questions in the chat as well. You mentioned in the presentation that well, the research was done before the COVID times, and you also saw that different seeds are planted that could help the general system grow. So I was wondering, how did you saw at the university these seeds actually being helpful to facilitate this emergency transition to the COVID situation, but also to prepare for the current semester already now in September, where again, a lot of things are away from being traditional university.
In which way it has helped? Well, for example, in terms of training for teaching staff, we knew that there were a lot of initiatives existing in the different services, in the different centers, but it was not very visible and not visible at one point. So for example, this portal was an initiative very useful to make sure that everybody knew what to get easily. So that was something, a small thing in the end, because the main thing already existed, but the small thing was to put it together and make it visible.
Thank you very much. And my next question will come from the chat. I see there is a question. What are the main challenges in assessing online courses, and how these challenges could be overcome based on your experience?
So if I'm not sure, but if you're talking about e-assessment, I mean exams online, there are of course several challenges. Some of them might be the checking of the identity of the student. A second might be how you control to avoid cheating or fraud. There are also, well, these are some challenges. And there are several ways to answer that. I'm sure all institutions have found their way lately to find solution for that. But of course, if you have a good platform, it helps. It helps to automatize a lot of things. For example, for the quiz, you can make sure that the questions come in a different order to each student, and that you cannot go back. So, for example, we as University of Geneva have decided not to monitor, to record the people. It was not accepted as a data protection. So we used honor. You have to sign on your honor that you will not cheat or fraud. Of course, this is not the best solution, but linked with other ways like short paper, short exams, open book exams, all that together we hope is good. And at the end, the results of last semester showed that it's not so different. The success of the session exam is not very different from the previous ones in normal format, presential. So we think it's quite good solutions that have been found.
Yeah, thank you so much for reflecting on that, because I see that there was another question related to this, like how do you see the issue of digital identification of the students? And if I understand correct from the side of your university, the approach was to ask them sign kind of a statement of honor to declare that they will do everything in line with the integrity. Please feel free to add on that if that's not the case. Yeah, actually another question comes on how you can assure academic integrity during online exams. So probably if you could reflect a little bit more, kind of what follows this statement of honor, I think that would really benefit our audience.
Well, I could share this statement if you want, maybe put on available for you. In terms of identity, the student has to show on the Zoom session the identity card and the student identity card with the picture. You wanted to ask about academic integrity. Yes, that's more or less what I answered already. I think it's a mixture of different solutions that were proposed.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. Because I think this is a good message of trust and building the systems on trust. And since we already need to wrap up, I give you the floor for the last remarks for no more than 2 minutes, and then we as the chair and presenter, we will move from this room.
Okay, so very shortly, 2 elements. First one is, I think as we have been facing this kind of difficult situation with the sanitary crisis, it was very useful for us to know on what to focus to get better, to see where the gaps were taking place. So I encourage you to do such an exercise, use a model with the dimension and indicators, the ones you think are more relevant to your situation. We use the ANCA model, and if you watch the video, you will know a little bit more about that. But I think it's a very, very important topic to be tackled. And I'm not sure we'll talk about that in other session, I suppose, but I think it's not only a question about external evaluation, but it's internal evaluation for us to know in our own institution what we should focus on. And the second element is just to mention that I had 3 specific questions where I wanted to welcome your input on those 3 topics that I used in this 5 minutes presentation. And you will be able to find them here on a Padlet, so on this link. And please, even after the session, if you have the time and you want to, go there, you'll find the 3 questions and put your opinion, your experience. It's very welcome for us in our institution. Thank you very much for that, for your attention, and have a nice continuous session.
Indeed, and thank you so much, Ahitopa, for such great insights that were shared with our audience. And we leave now to the next room. Stay here, you will soon receive your next speakers and chairs. See you later.
Good morning. Sorry for me being a bit confused by the format, but I am very glad to be able to announce you the session of Stef Black. Stef is a senior development consultant for sparqs, the Scottish sector agency focused on engaging students within quality assurance and enhancement. sparqs is well networked internationally and has an exemplary role within Europe in the field of student engagement. So thank you very much, Stef, for your presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today to listen to this session. I'm just going to share my screen with you so you can see my presentation, and I'll get started. Just checking that everyone can see that okay. Yeah, brilliant. So what I'm going to take you through very briefly is some of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of months in Scotland, which is exploring how those institutions who took their internal reviews online once the pandemic hit had the unintended consequence of actually increasing student engagement. So back in March, when everything happened, institutions had 2 choices really. They could delay their internal reviews, or they could decide to take their internal reviews online. Many chose to delay, given the circumstances and the kind of uncertainty. However, some did decide to continue, and they adapted their reviews to be conducted in an online format. Those who did had to very quickly think about what that would mean for student engagement and how they could ensure that students were still able to engage in this online approach. And some of them took very different approaches, some very similar in terms of how they provided opportunities for students to be engaging in this online space. So what were some of the changes that institutions made? In some instances, electronic surveys were then sent in advance to all students and all graduates on the programme that was under review, containing a series of questions that asked them about their experience as a student on that programme, what had worked, what hadn't, and what could make things better. And that was gathered and then sent to the review panel in advance. In other instances, groups of students were brought together online prior to the review to discuss some successes and challenges and answer questions that were posed by the quality team, which again was fed back then to the panel, so that data was captured and kind of discussed again. And there was also the opportunity to meet one-to-one with the review convener prior to the panel to provide individual feedback on their experience as a student on that programme and what they thought about and what they think could improve things for the future. And there was also a concerted effort by everyone, and student associations in particular, to provide additional support for students who were engaging in the review so that they were comfortable and happy with how the online format would work and what their engagement and contribution would look like. So what were some of the benefits that we saw through doing reviews online? And I think one of the biggest things that came through in the discussions was the breadth of opinion that institutions had from students. So they just had a wider range of students engaging in the review and from a much more diverse group of students. So even where numbers were maybe quite similar to before, they noticed that generally it tended to be students who hadn't previously engaged in these types of processes. So we're seeing a much wider range of opinion, and that was noted obviously is really useful for the institutions to kind of understand and hear from students that they traditionally hadn't heard of from before. It was also noted that there was much easier to engage in the online environment in a space and time convenient to them. So there was the fact that they didn't have to travel to and from a campus, for example, to take part in the review. They could just join in and they could do the process, and then they had their own space and time to do that. So that was noted as definitely one of a big advantage for students. It was also noted that it was much more accessible and that the students really appreciated the range of functions to engage in. So the fact that they could, for example, raise a hand when wishing to come in was seen as really valuable and much more easier rather than trying to catch the convener's eye in a face-to-face environment to sort of kind of note that they wanted to speak. It was also pointed out that they really liked the fact that they could agree with a statement made by someone else through like a thumbs up feature. And also that they could still have their opinion heard and they could still contribute without necessarily having to come on camera and speak because they could use the chat function. And so they appreciated the fact there was a variety of tools and functions available to them that made it more accessible. It was also noted by some that the experience was far less daunting. It didn't feel as formal because it was in an online space and everyone felt more equal and there was less of a kind of hierarchy and then there can be sometimes in a face-to-face environment, so that people and the students felt much more comfortable and confident in speaking up. And it was also noted that they just felt there was a much wider range of opportunities, so there was more opportunities to engage at different times, not just in the review itself as how it traditionally would have happened, but in the additional opportunities that were presented prior to the review. And that was really noted from students as something that was a great benefit to them. Of course, with any benefits, there are some challenges, and these were some of the challenges that were observed in terms of taking the reviews online. Digital fatigue was noted as something that institutions had to be really conscious about, not to overburden or put more pressure on panel members or on students in that online environment. They had to be much more conscious about adding in more breaks, and the reviews did take longer and they spread them over more days to ensure that people weren't sitting at a screen for very, very long periods of time. The digital literacy was noted as a challenge, just ensuring that everyone had the capacity to engage, so that they had access to the right equipment, the right software, a good enough Wi-Fi signal, and the right space to be able to engage in a digital environment, and just ensuring that everyone was comfortable with that. And that links to the fact that it was noted that there was a lot more additional support required. Institutions chose to develop guidance to actually support panel members and students to be engaging in the online environment and seeing how it would be similar or different, or how it would impact on chairing or contributing because it was going to be online. And one of the things that was noted that I think was definitely a real challenge for a lot of institutions was around about the speed of change. We went into the lockdown 23rd of March in the UK, and we had some institutions that had internal reviews within the first few weeks of April. So they had a very, very short turnaround time to adapt what is a largely paper-based process into an online environment, and ensure that panel members still had all the right paperwork and notes that they needed to conduct the review. And that everyone had the right links and the right information about the review happening in an online environment. So quality teams really adapted very quickly and really took on the challenge of doing that, but it was difficult for them to do that so quickly. One thing that has come out of the conversations that I've been having across the sector is that we're seeing an emerging pattern here. It's not even just within internal reviews, but there's just an increase in engagement and attendance across a whole range of activity. So we're seeing it at training events, at network meetings, at student staff consultative meetings, at sector committees. There's a significant surge here from students and a wider range of students engaging. And I think it's really important as we move forward that we begin to understand why and start to unpick some of that and think about what are the contributing factors to why we're seeing this surge of engagement. So we're only kind of starting to really go into this in the project that we're working on here at sparqs, but we have started to kind of pull apart some of the reasons that it might be that we're keen to explore further with institutions and with students. So obviously the one of them is the fact that we're all online. This is the way to engage, and there's not as many options or variety to engagement because we've kind of come out of that face-to-face space and we're all here on the online. So it's the only way, and this is the only option that they have. We know that students might have additional worries or fears at the moment, and therefore it might just be that they want more opportunity to discuss them and speak to people about them. We also know that, you know, because there is good practice going on, that students are probably quite keen to learn about that practice, and for them making sure that they're protecting their learning experience, that their education experience isn't being adversely affected because of the move to an online environment. As I've touched on, the online format is for some more accessible and it's easier to engage, so that might be another reason why we're seeing such a surge. We also have to note the obvious that we are going through a global pandemic at the moment, and there is a lot more uncertainty as to what the future holds, and therefore students probably do have more to say. They have more queries and questions and concerns, but they want to find the time and space to be able to have these types of conversations. We also know that one of the kind of challenges that has been presented by the online environment is many students feeling lonely and isolated. And so any opportunity to be able to engage in some activities where they can speak to other people, they can contribute, they can have discussion, maybe that they wouldn't normally engage in, but because of the online environment, they're taking that opportunity. And that links something to the last point there, that it might just be that it's something to do for some of them. It is that chance to kind of get involved and do something a bit different, especially if they haven't got the same experiences that they would normally have because of the pandemic. So what I wanted to kind of highlight here is a really interesting observation that I had with one colleague where I was having these discussions, and we got to the end of the phone call and she said to me, you know, it's interesting, we've always had the tech, but we just never thought to use it. And I think that really highlights what I'm talking about today, is that nothing here is particularly innovative. You know, we've not changed the face of student engagement and internal reviews. Many of the things that institutions have done, they could have been doing before. But it took a pandemic to actually do some of this, and we have then seen an increase in student engagement. So we really need to think about that and think about how we move forward and what that means for how we continue to do internal reviews and quality assurance in the months and years to come. So for us, that very much leads to that question, where do we go from here? So we'll be continuing to do this research as more institutions across Scotland continue to conduct internal reviews online, as we now know that this is going to be happening for at least the next academic year. So every institution will have to be doing this. So we're really keen to start gathering evidence of how institutions have adapted their internal processes and begin to understand more about why student engagement has increased and diversified because of these online formats. We're really keen to capture that positive practice where we have seen successes, what worked and why, and curate that and send it back out to the sector so we can share that and have conversations about that. And then I think really that last point there, we're very keen to nurture those successes and to see where there have been positive changes to student engagement, that we can embed them into our normal practice, you know, so that we don't just go back to what we did before because that's how we've always done it. But actually, how do we take some of this activity, some of these practices, and mainstream them into how we do quality assurance going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stef. We will now move on to the questions. So I'll invite you to put your questions in the chat box. So a first question for me, Stef. In Flanders, we have usually had the experience that participation in online formats was much smaller than in person. How did you do it to get a greater participation in the online format? Have you taken any specific action to stimulate this?
I think pre-pandemic, we would have said similarly that, you know, when there was a choice between engaging in an online environment or engaging in a face-to-face environment, that students would naturally prefer the face-to-face environment for all that afforded. I think one thing that we've seen generally, just the fact that we're seeing more engagement in the online environment, beyond the fact that it is the only way to do things, is there has been a real concerted effort from institutions, from staff, to try and adapt as much as possible into these online spheres and to ensure that students have got the opportunity and the space to be contributing in as normal a way as possible. And we're seeing that students are recognising that, and are, you know, we are seeing that there's an appreciation for the fact that we're trying to do as much as possible to take everything online and to make it still accessible and still relevant, and that students are still able to get their learning and teaching and to get their curriculum and to get access to their opportunities. And we know that for some students, they really do prefer an online environment. And that, you know, now that they've had this for 8-9 months, that, you know, they want to almost continue with it. So I think it's a mixture of things that have really come into play. But I think, you know, before we always had spaces where people learn online, you know, online and distance learning has always been a thing. But now that everyone's in that boat, there's been a much more concerted effort to really address some of the challenges and try to tackle them.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of participation activities did you organize for the students?
Student associations have actually been brilliant at trying to just even more generally, even outside of internal reviews, but just more generally provide opportunities and space for students in online environments to connect. I see a question has just come in there about mental health, and I think that's something that people have been so conscious about, is that because of isolation and because of loneliness, and because of the fact that we are going through a global pandemic and people are having probably a much more difficult time. We've got students who maybe previously had never had caring responsibilities or had never had some of the issues they're now having to deal with. This pandemic has exacerbated a lot of that. And so student associations have been very conscious to make sure that there's still a chance to create online communities and for students to still be able to interact and meet with one another and to have that kind of informal space as well. And I think that has been in part with reaction to the fact that we are going to probably see quite a surge in mental well-being support needs from students.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think also that also in Flanders, it's in the news that students have a lot of difficulties at the moment that we will have to cope with, also with our quality management system, to see how we can resolve also a bit of their pain there. Then another question, what have been some of the biggest obstacles and or challenges that you have encountered during this period?
I think I touched on it slightly there, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we have encountered just in general with regards to online and the online space and student engagement, it's just the students having the right access to the equipment that they need. So both the digital equipment, so that they have a laptop, that they have Wi-Fi, but actually the physical environment that they're in, that they have a desk, that they have a chair, that they have a safe space to work in, a quiet space to work in. I think some of that is what we've really been trying to unpick as to what impact that can have on students being able to engage. You know, it's not I'm not wanting to, it's just that maybe they don't have the means to, and how can we understand that and support that, and what measures can be put in place across institutions to ensure all of the right tools and mechanisms to be engaging in an online environment.
Okay, then I have another question here. Have you tried to get students' feedback on the effectiveness of the online courses, teaching and learning? And if yes, what were the main factors that you asked them to reflect on?
So yeah, I mean, we've both been doing this at a national level, and institutions have been doing it at a local level. So we know that a lot of institutions are adapting or modifying internal surveys and module evaluations to purposely include questions around about online teaching, online learning and teaching, and what has been the impact for students. At sparqs ourselves, we're actually conducting a national research project that will look at what has been the impact of the pandemic on the student learning experience, and that will have a particular focus on the learning and teaching processes. So how has a move to a digital teaching environment, what has that meant for students? Some of the things we're asking them to reflect on is around about some of the practices, the innovative practices that have taken place that can be looked at and explored further, where the challenges have been and how they have been addressed, what the common challenges and struggles have been across the institutions, so not just to even a student or a cohort, but some of those common challenges that we as a sector therefore need to address. We're also very keen to explore around about the diversity of the students and how different cohorts have been adversely affected, and what have been some of the barriers or enablers for those students being able to engage in online teaching. So I think there's a mixture of work going on at the moment, but I think it's very important to the sector and to ourselves to be getting that student feedback on how effective online learning has been, and where some of the benefits and challenges have been.
Okay, thank you very much, Stef. I see here the message that we have only 1 minute to end, so I take this minute to thank you very much and to thank the audience to follow this session. I hope to meet again on the following EQAF, and I hope you take a lot of information back to your institution. It was a very interesting session, Stef. Now I think we will have to move to another room, so you will have to give us some time to take the technical arrangement, and then perhaps we see each other later during this EQAF. Thank you very much to you all.
Thank you.
So my name is Mairéad. I am the director of EQAF, which is the European Association for Quality Assurance in Higher Education in Brussels. And I'm happy to welcome you to this session, which is entitled Exceptional Times, Main Challenges to Higher Education Internal Quality Assurance Systems. We surely do live in exceptional times, and I think that the IQ systems really have a key role that they can play in helping people navigate through these times. So I'm very happy to introduce our Rodrigo Teixeira Lourenço, who is the Pro-President for Quality Management and Assurance and Promotion of Academic Success in the Polytechnic Institute of Setúbal in Portugal. He is also a founding member of the Research Network and of Higher Education Management Forum in Portuguese-speaking countries and regions. So he will give us a brief presentation of how his institution's IQA systems reacted in these times, drawing also a bit wider conclusions or lessons learned from that experience. And after the presentation, as by now you are also already acquainted with the system, there will be a discussion for about almost 10 minutes or maybe 10 minutes and a bit more depending. So please post your questions as we go into the chat so we can pick those up and address them to the speaker later on in this session. In the meantime, Rodrigo,
thank you, Maria. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my presentation. Okay. First of all, we would like to thank to European University Association and the organization of the EQAF in the opportunity to be here and present our experience. It's a huge honor for us. Congratulations to the organization, which has been sensational. A very special thank, of course, to our chair, Mairéad. Thank you. Our presentation, which we call it Exceptional Times, the main changes to our higher educational internal quality assurance system, has the objective to show the Polytechnic of Setúbal response to the problems caused by the pandemic. What extent this response has brought us important knowledge about our quality management system and its real capacity to respond to the students' needs. My name is Rodrigo Teixeira Lourenço. I'm from Polytechnic of Setúbal in Portugal, and this presentation was made with my colleagues Helena Gonçalves and Angela Lemos. Our focus was to keep all teaching activities running with the best possible response, but also guarantee that all administrative response to the students remain operational. We think that when we talk distance learning, does not only means that the students have access to the class, learning contents and evaluation, but also that they have access to all services such as libraries, computer resources, academic service, etc., which was a very big challenge. So we divided this process in 4 phases. In the first phases, we interrupt all activities in Polytechnic of Setúbal to prepare the second phase. We call it EPS Online. In 50 days hard work, we prepared the EPS Online. On the third phases, we focus on students and teachers. For teachers, the pedagogical training plan was intensified, and it were produced guidelines, documents, which allowed teachers to have a common understand what at the same themes about distance learning. For students, a very strong campaign was made to minimize the impacts of distance learning and the social inequalities with the computer loan programs and the broadband provision. In the fourth phases, the focus was the monitoring. A follow-up group with weekly meetings and weekly report to student association, and also questionnaires for teachers and students. This process was based in 4 important pillars: a good coordination, global guidelines for orientation, planning training, and monitoring based on instruments that we have talked earlier. About monitoring and about results, about survey, we think that's important from here. We identified 3 strengths in this process. a good ability to respond to the student information technology system needs, the great commitment and support demonstrated by teachers, the good ability of teachers in using information technologies in distance learning. But we also have weakness. Students' difficulty in work alone and make it compatibly with family life, students' excessive workload, teachers' difficulty to implement evaluation mechanisms. In our meetings, weekly meetings, we also identified well-defined responsibilities and clear, good coordination capacity between different actors, decision-making process as well informed as possible, teachers' training plans appropriate to the needs, and focus given to the new teachings methodologies, but also weakness, and that was very important. Even inability to evaluate the excessive workload, the difficult to validate students' assessment mechanism, and difficult to formalize students' participation throughout the monitoring process. Well, this weakness has made it possible to identify two major difficulties, and which are at the same time two major challenges for the quality systems. First of all, how quality monitoring of the teachings and learning process allow rapid action mechanisms, and how quality systems respond more effectively with enough flexibility to higher education students' needs, improving their academic results. Our job now is identifying the points that can be discussed internally in order to improve the quality management systems, namely, we need more organizational structures of quality management, more flexible. We have to integrate monitoring of in-pedagogical practice. We have to greater capacity of autonomy of decision, but also associated with good coordination capacity. We have to be more focused on the needs students, more engagement between students and teachers, and more clearly the continuous improvement. That's all our contribution to EQAF. Mairéad.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I'm going to stop my presentation. Okay.
Can have some questions. There is one question, but I have asked for some clarification on that. So in the meantime, I will ask you something. But please do keep your questions coming. This is your last chance in this session for the IQA system. So make good use of that. One question I had is that you talk about well-defined responsibilities. So how that is a success factor when there is a clear structure or clear responsibilities on how to deal with this. Could you elaborate that a little bit more and explain perhaps some of the key functions or key roles that there were in your system and what made it successful?
Yeah, I think our coordination process was very important. I think we think that was the big, the most important factor in the pandemic situation. Our first concern was to communicate with the different actors throughout the process. The communication was very strong and communication, that less communication was a risk, of course. If this communication was not fast and fluid, we know that we would have a complex problem. So in each school, we identified a member of the management in each school that was responsible for implementing the distance learning. And the group, the responsible in each school, create a group, was designed a distance learning coordination group that meets weekly to analyze the entire transition process and the problems that were appearing. In addition to have allowing us to have access to information about the process, to be able to respond, it was possible to discuss many of the uses association with the distance learning, which allowed to gain a lot of knowledge about this. And then we have the course coordination. The course coordination have and teachers. Three levels was the most focus in our structure.
Key point. Good.
Yeah.
I have another question which regards your description of your process you had in your slide 3, which we don't have now open, but that's okay. You know what it is. It describes it as a linear process. So as in a timeline, first you did this, then that, then that. And the question is, can it really be happening such in a linear way, or maybe they should be actually progressing in parallel? For example, the students and teachers' focus should be in parallel to the rest of the steps.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Of course not. Of course not. It's not linear. Sometimes the image help us to show what was our process, but of course there are feedback constantly. Well, maybe we cannot say that that was a strategic definition. We don't have a strategy. We have response immediately to the problems, but in such situation, this decision were being made by time. But the most important was the orientation, the strategic orientation, and that was very clear. The strategic orientation was response to the student needs. Was all the things that we have done was to respond to the student needs. So if we have to come back and redoing something, we come back and redo something. The planning, training, the orientations, everything that we have done, decision maybe can be different in the next week or in the next month. Okay, that was the strategic orientation. Students' needs. The main concern was that were a very large alignment between the different actors. Okay, the school directors, the pedagogical councils, the course coordination. Alignment was intended to the board that was possible. But of course, this is not a linear process. It is clear it is not linear process. There's two things important in this non-linear process are coordination and the vision, strategic vision, students' needs. What was for us the 2 points that for us was clear for everyone.
Yeah, very good. There is a whole list of questions in the chat, and I already apologize, we will not be able to address all of those questions, unfortunately, but hold that thought. At lunch break, you will be able to discuss all of that with colleagues. But there is an interesting one to which I actually am also very curious to hear the response from Ule, who is asking, did you identify any needs to change your rules or regulations distance learning or to allow for that? Were there some, because sometimes we hear that it is the regulatory basis that is so rigid that it doesn't allow for online assessment, for example, or things like that, to change the rules to allow for this kind of adaptations in your context?
Well, I think we have to improve. Okay, of course we have to improve, and we have to improve. I think we have to improve in not only in the distance learning, but in all the process of learning, teaching and learning, and we have to. The system of quality have to improve in two areas. Bureaucracy process and information management. Of course, when we have several instruments to monitor the entire process of teaching process. We have pedagogical surveys, we have course monitoring reports, we have signalized curricular units with academic results and the failure of the units. We have course evaluation and monitoring commissions. We have analyzed the signalized courses units. We have improvement plans. We have a lot of instruments, but sometimes, however, what we see is that the information is not integrated, and not even sometimes we must have two mechanisms to that can be integrated all the information to have more decisions. Decisions are more informed and more focused on the real problems. That was something that we identify that we don't have answers in the pandemic. So we think that can be more work in the future. In 2 points: bureaucracy process and information management. I think, yeah.
Thank you very much. So many interesting questions, so many interesting things you could still share with us, but I've been told the time is up indeed. So apologies for all those whose questions were not addressed, but hold those thoughts, keep them for the networking session. And I think you can also contact the speakers later on if you have your questions. Before I leave you, I don't know actually who is exactly leaving home. I think none of us is leaving anything or anybody. What will happen next is that we will all be moved to the main room. So we will be reconvening with everybody who was there at the beginning of the session. That's what we hope. It might take a little bit longer than just for you to get the new speakers in between these sessions. So bear with us, and don't leave, please don't leave. We have some conclusions for the last couple of minutes and some instructions also for the remainder of the day. There will be a networking lunch and other sessions still today. So please stay with us. Remember that the presentation is available on the YouTube channel of EUA. You can access that in any future moment. And also there is a longer version of this presentation with a bit more in-depth information on these elements. So do go and have a look at that as well if you are interested. And now all that remains to me is to thank very much Rodrigo for having done very nicely 4 times this presentation, a session, answered difficult questions and easier ones. And thank you for all of those who have participated so actively also through the chat. And see you in a minute in the main room. Bye for now.